the closing ceremony for this year's summer learning program a couple of weeks ago, the children performed music and skits based on the story of Jesus stilling the storm. A story similar in many ways to our passage from the Gospel of Matthew this morning, in which Peter steps out of the boat and onto the waves to walk on the water toward Jesus, but begins to sink in fear when he takes his eyes off Jesus and puts them on the churning, restless waves all about him. In the story that the children's play was based on, the disciples were in a boat on the lake and a storm arose, threatening to swamp their boat, and they were filled with fear. In that story, Jesus stilled the storm and then asked them all why they had been afraid. In one of the bits of dialogue, a little boy portraying one of the disciples proclaimed, "I'm not afraid of anything." Another child portraying another disciple asked him, "Not anything?" "No, not anything," he boldly stated. Then the children began to give a list of things that frightened them. "I saw a snake in my backyard. I heard there is this new disease that melts your skin and eats your eyeballs and turns you into a zombie. I have monsters that live underneath my bed." There was quiet laughter, as there was just then, from the adults and other children in the room in response to these familiar childhood fears. Then one little girl came to the microphone and said, "There was a drive-by shooting in my neighborhood last night." There was a deafening silence that fell over the room as that fear reverberated in our ears, because all of us present, family members and friends, tutors and staff, realized that this little girl's fear was not a fantasy, but a reality. We hear stories during the year at STARE and during the summer at Summer Learning Program about drive-by shootings in the neighborhoods where these children live. Some of them have witnessed such shootings. Others have had family members or neighbors who have been injured or even killed by gun violence. After a few moments of that deep silence, the first little boy who had proclaimed he was not afraid of anything said, "Well, maybe I am afraid of a few things. The world can be a scary place." Indeed, the world can be a scary place, and at times it is easy to become overwhelmed with fear as we focus on the churning, restless waves all around us in our lives and in the world. We can become so fearful and overwhelmed, in fact, that we may, like Peter before us, find ourselves sinking into those churning waters, afraid that we will drown. I don't know about all of you, but in the last 3 months, since I have been away from you and IPC on sabbatical, it feels to me as if the world has gone crazy. And there have been plenty of times when I have felt overwhelmed by the churning, restless waves swirling around us in our world. You know the litany. War between Israel and Hamas, resulting in wholesale destruction in the Gaza Strip, dead soldiers and civilians in Israel, and nearly 2,000 dead in Gaza, hundreds of them innocent children. The Ebola virus ravaging nations in West Africa, now declared an international health emergency. Planes shot out of the sky as a result of the border wars between Ukraine and Russia. Thousands of unaccompanied children pouring across our southern borders here in the United States, fleeing homes of poverty and violence in Central America. Refugees around the world fleeing violence in places like South Sudan, the Central African Republic, and Syria. And now the latest horror to hit our television screens, ISIS, which I will just say out loud to you seems like evil itself personified, murdering Christians and other religious minorities across Syria and now Iraq, driving them from their homes into the mountains, where many, it seems, are now dying of thirst and heat and hunger and exposure, resulting in humanitarian aid via airdrops from U.S. planes, as well as military airstrikes aimed at weakening some of the ISIS arsenal. And all of those things do not even touch on the crises closer to home: poverty in our own city, failing city schools, the homeless on our streets, an overcrowded and broken state prison system, dysfunctional state and local politics, nor does it touch on the personal storms any of you may feel buffeted by this very morning. Illness or injury in your own body or in the body of someone you love, economic worries, a strained marriage, a child in trouble, an addiction that threatens everything you love, depression or loneliness that make it hard to get out of the bed in the morning, or a crushing grief that feels overwhelming. Yes, the world can be a scary place, and we often feel helpless to effect any change on all the trouble we see out there in the wider world, or just a few blocks from here, or in our own homes, or even in our own hearts. And at times, we may feel our fear threaten to overwhelm us as these restless waves swirl around us. And we may, like Peter on that water so long ago, feel ourselves sinking and cry out for help and for salvation. Anne Lamott, a sometimes irreverent but always honest Christian writer, wrote about her own response to the world situation a couple of weeks ago. In part, she wrote, some of what she wrote I can't read, but the part I can read, in part she wrote, "Many mornings I check out the news as soon as I wake up, because if it turns out that the world is coming to an end that day, I am going to eat the frosting off an entire carrot cake just for a start. Then I will move on to vats of clam dip, pots of creme brulee, nachos, M&Ms, etc. Then I will max out both my credit cards." The last 2 weeks have been about as grim and hopeless as any of us can remember. "I'm not depressed, I'm overwhelmed by it all," she writes. That is about right, it seems to me. Many of us have been operating on the level of feeling overwhelmed and wondering what we might do that could help us, help each other, and help the world. Well, I have 4 simple suggestions that I want to make today based on our gospel story and on the whole of the life of Jesus Christ that I hope might be of some practical help in keeping afloat on the restless waves of our world. First, as hard as it may be, it seems important that we stay informed, that we not close our eyes to the pain of the world or the pain of our city or the pain in our lives or the lives of those we know and love, that we not try to run away and hide. You see, in today's story, Jesus did not tell Peter to just stay in that boat where he would be relatively safe and sound. On the contrary, he called him out of the safety of the boat into the midst of the very waves that frightened him the most. And throughout his life and ministry, Jesus called his disciples time and time again to enter into the pain and brokenness of the world, not to avert their eyes, not to run and hide, but to see the pain and brokenness, the sin and evil, to face their own fears and to enter into the fray. So first, I think Jesus calls us to stay informed, to really look at the churning waves around us and to wade into the fray. Now, I am not saying that we all need to stay glued to CNN 24 hours a day, heaven forbid. I am well aware that there has to be a balance between watching news and getting enough information to stay informed and turning the news off to watch, say, The Big Bang Theory. I know we have to get away from television screens entirely and go out into the wider world to walk around the block or in the woods, to go to the beach or the lake or the mountains, to visit a garden or drive out into rural Alabama and see the farmland around us, and remember that the world is not only cruel and fearful and sometimes ugly, but it is also beautiful and glorious, and God called that creation good. We need to spend time with our families and our friends and with our church family. We need to laugh until our cheeks and our sides ache. We need to stay informed not only about the pain and cruelty and violence of the world, but also to search out stories of kindness and goodness and faithfulness and hope. Because in reality, there are so many more of those happening every day, quietly and without notice, than there are stories of hatred and cruelty and violence. But still, God calls us to stay informed about all of life, to look the world in all its beauty and in all its cruelty full in the face, and to wade out into those churning waters. My second suggestion is that we pray daily, several times a day, for God's world, for God's children all around the world, for peace, for healing, for an end to violence and hatred, for love and kindness and justice and peace and mercy to prevail, for the coming of God's kingdom. Our story from Matthew today begins with Jesus sending the disciples on ahead of him in the boat so that he can draw apart and pray. Jesus spent a lot of time in prayer, together with his disciples and on his own. I had a lot of time on sabbatical to pray, very intentionally, carving out the time and space to rest in the presence of God, sharing my thoughts, fears, dreams, hopes, griefs, joys, desires, and frustrations with God. I also spent some time in silence, listening for what God might be trying to tell me. It is so easy in our busy lives to let intentional prayer fall by the wayside. I have had periods of time over the years when my own prayer life became dry and neglected. Just before sabbatical, I had fallen into just such a time. So I knew sabbatical would be a time when I would be very intentional about my prayer life. What I can tell you is that when I pray, really pray, carving out the intentional time and space to simply be in God's presence, my spirit is filled with so much more peace, no matter what might be happening in my own life or out there in the wider world. So in the midst of these restless waves around us, I encourage all of us to pray every day. Speak to God. Listen to God. When you can't find the words, just sit in silence, trusting that the Spirit is interceding on your behalf with sighs too deep for words. Pray at home, at work, in the car. Pray by walking the labyrinth in our new prayer garden here at IPC. Pray alone, with your family, with your friends, with your fellow church members. Pray unceasingly, because the world desperately needs our prayers. Third, do what you can to be a force for goodness, for peace, for justice, for hope, for love and compassion and kindness in our world and in our own community here in Birmingham and in the lives of those you know and love. Jesus called his disciples regularly to enter into the pain of the world, and once there, to speak words of hope and comfort, to touch wounds and seek to heal them, to forgive and to offer mercy and reconciliation, to make peace in times of division, to seek justice, to feed the hungry, to give drink to the thirsty, to welcome those whom the world denied, to be God's love in a broken and hurting world. So we may not be able to prevent the children in Gaza or Iraq from dying, but we can do all we can to help children who are in trouble right here in our own community by volunteering with STARE and the Summer Learning Program, by comforting a homeless child at First Light, or volunteering to read to a classroom of children at Hayes School. In a couple of weeks, we will ask you to help donate supplies and put together school kits for Church World Service that will be delivered to children around the world in refugee camps and war zones and other desperate situations, so that they will have the most basic supplies they need to continue their education in the midst of the chaos swirling around them. That is a very concrete way we can help. We may not be able to stop ISIS from driving Christians and others out of Iraq or causing them harm, but we can give monetary donations to organizations helping the refugees from Syria and Iraq and other places around the world, like Church World Service, and we can serve the homeless who are the refugees of our own community. We may not be able to stop the spread of Ebola or to treat those who are suffering in West Africa, but we can give funds, again, to try to help with their care, and we can prepare a good meal for the sick in our own congregation when they return home from the hospital through the Love Thy Neighbor ministry, Or we can knit a prayer shawl to wrap them in our love and be a concrete symbol of our prayers and our love for those who are sick or who are grieving. We may not be able to feed the starving multitudes around the world, but we can bring some canned food to our own food pantry to feed our hungry neighbors. We may not be able to extinguish the world weariness in the eyes of children in war-torn lands, but we can foster the light in the eyes of our own children here at IPC by teaching them about the love of Christ in the atrium or in other Sunday school classes. And we can keep hope and light alive in the eyes of children of poverty here in Birmingham through other programs at IPC. Yes, when we despair of the cruelty of the world, we can practice love and kindness, justice and mercy, peacemaking and hope building in very simple and concrete ways in the name and for the sake of Jesus Christ, who calls us to love one another as we have first been loved by him. Do all that you can in your own life to bring light to our darkened world. Your light is so important. Finally, even when we feel that the world is falling apart, even when the waves around us are threatening to overwhelm us, even when it seems we cannot feel God's presence in our lives or in the world, we can summon our faith and trust that God is there, loving, forgiving, doing justice, making peace, healing, comforting, strengthening, grieving, calling us all to be better, to do better, to hope and to help and to forgive and to love. When Jesus called Peter out of the boat into the midst of those fearful waves, Peter went joyfully and with loving trust in his Lord and friend. It was not until he took his eyes off of Jesus and focused instead on the restless waves around him that he became afraid and was in danger of drowning. Even as his faith was faltering, he cried out for help, and Jesus reached out his hand and pulled him to safety, asking him, "Why did you fear?" Jesus seemed to be saying to Peter, "You can trust me. I am here with you in the midst of your fear, in the midst of these restless, churning, overwhelming waves. I will not leave you." During my sabbatical, I went to England with my sister Kim and my 17-year-old niece Catherine. One day we traveled to Salisbury Cathedral. There is a beautiful, large baptismal font in the center of that ancient cathedral. The water is level and still on the large surface of the font, and that still water acts as a kind of mirror, reflecting the image of the beautiful architecture of the cathedral's vaulted ceilings and the brilliant colors of its stained glass windows. It also reflects the faces of those looking into those waters of baptism. Carved into the edge of the font are the words from Isaiah we heard this morning. "Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you." As I read those words, I looked up and saw my beloved niece's face reflected in that water. She is beginning her senior year in high school and will soon be launched off into the larger world, an experience many of you have had with your own children. I felt a moment of overwhelming gratitude to know that she has passed through baptismal waters, that God knows her and has called her by name, that God will be with her, whatever may come. You see, in those words, God does not promise us that we will not pass through troubled, even overwhelming waters. We will. We do. Sometimes those waters are the restless waves of a troubled and broken world. Sometimes those waters are the restless waves of our own personal experiences of illness, doubt, pain, and deep grief. The promise is not that we will not experience restless waves. The promise is that God will be with us through it all. God is in the midst of our lives. God is in the midst of the world. The promise is that God knows us by name. God knows your name and mine. God knows the name of every patient battling Ebola in West Africa. God knows the name of every child sleeping in a shelter on the borders of our own country, far away from their homes and their families. God knows the name of every child in Israel and Gaza and Syria and Iraq. God has called you by name. God calls them by name. God will be with us all, giving us peace amid the restless waves. That is the promise. Like Peter on those restless waves, if we focus our hearts on Christ, on the abiding presence of God, if we trust in his presence in spite of the restlessness around us and the fear within us, we will find a peace and a strength that will help to carry us through, no matter what may come. We will have the quiet confidence to know that ultimately there is nothing that can separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ our Lord. Not life, not death, nothing. So let us remember the words of Jesus spoken from the midst of those restless waves. Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. Thanks be to God. Amen.